Don't change everything you do or really fundamentally what you do because of one year's events. We kind of always chase the tail of what happened last year. If 9 years out of 10 it worked, it's probably a good idea. You don't want to have something, 1 year be a problem and then really change everything about your farm. It really is that big picture. What happens over 10 years, 15, 20, kind of the span of your operation.
I think that is fantastic advice. This is Around the Farm, the podcast about all things ag. I'm your host, Clint Chaffer, and today we're going to be talking with Mark Reiman from the Gothenburg Water Utilization Learning Center. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Glenn.
How about you introduce yourself to our listeners?
So I'm Mark Reiman. I'm the Learning Center Manager for the Bayer Water Utilization Learning Center in Gothenburg, Nebraska. It's a facility in western Nebraska where I get the opportunity to do really a lot of, I'd say, unique research work around kind of our dry conditions, and then also have the opportunity to really showcase that to producers throughout the year. So you get that research aspect, but then we also get to really show it off to people throughout the growing season.
Nice. Now, I would assume when you say water utilization, and if I'm thinking about Nebraska, I'm thinking center pivots. So I would assume there's some irrigation on this farm as well.
We have the ability to variable rate irrigate with a lot of our irrigation equipment. We use a lot of linears, so they're not pivots in that they don't spin in a circle, but they go in a straight line, so they help us manage our research projects a little bit easier. And then we also have a lot of drip irrigation. So we started the Learning Center. There wasn't as much, I'd say, innovation in the space of variable rate irrigation through sprinklers. We had the drip irrigation to kind of set that up initially, and now we've got kind of that nozzle by nozzle control on our irrigation systems.
Where we farm at, we're in a little pocket of the Mississippi River bottom where there's a bunch of sand. So I'm actually in the heart of irrigation land in the middle of western Illinois. So you wouldn't think it, but there's a ton of center pivots around here. And I know a lot of folks are starting to get onto that, variable rate irrigation. Is it down to nozzle by nozzle now then?
Yeah, there are options where it really can be a nozzle by nozzle setup. And it sort of depends on your field and variability, but you can do it in banks of nozzles, maybe tie 4, 5, 6 together or something like that. Or you can go all the way down to the nozzle. And what a lot of farmers actually do is they just have the ability, as their pivot goes around, they can vary the speed of that pivot so they reduce the rate of irrigation. So there's kind of all different levels you can go to as far as, I guess, how precise you want or how small you want the area to be that you irrigate. And we, for our research projects, we want to get down to some pretty small areas where we're trying to, test one corn product or one soybean product versus another in some of those different environments we can create with it.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the testing aspect. I was kind of curious, what would you consider the overall mission for the research facility then?
So it really is to go after like our high plains challenges. It could be irrigated, it could be dryland, but it really is to kind of take input from our farmers, go after those high plains challenges, and then kind of really help them out in their system. So whether that be, utilizing water differently or something like that through the irrigation piece, or it could be helping manage dryland better. Could be using, maybe looking at some of the newest Bayer products that are going to be available on those acres. And then the other thing that we really added over the past, I'd say 2 years, we've been, typically in an area where they would say you can't really use cover crops because it's too dry. We've been starting to find ways to integrate those into our systems from a, kind of overall soil health, carbon type of play that we can bring in. We're already doing a lot of no-till. How can we bring cover crops and some of those next steps into what we do here in the West?
I've heard some folks talk about that from a cover crop perspective. Is there certain varieties or cocktail mixes that could actually help in the retention of water within the soil?
It really is. I think it's a situational thing. There's just situations, and I think, if you pay attention to Twitter or cover crop sites, you're seeing with the really dry conditions this year where people are showing maybe it didn't matter what cover crop mix they planted or something, it did dry out the soil. And because we haven't had any rain since planting, which I think is a very rare condition for a lot of areas that are seeing that, that's something where you're seeing kind of a negative impact from a cover crop. But if you've got that cover crop there and it's terminated and you get some rain, you get a lot better water infiltration. You prevent some of that soil evaporation. So it may not necessarily be the cocktail mix that I think of, but it really is a little bit the situation. So if you're really dry in the spring and you don't get any rain, for us in the West, cover crops are going to be difficult to deal with unless we can irrigate. But if you do have some of that rain, those cover crops really help you retain it, help it infiltrate into the soil, and then prevent it from evaporating so your crop can use it later. It's one of those situational things where some years it really is a home run, and other years it can start out looking like a pretty rough situation.
I remember I was out at my buddy John's farm. He farms in between Omaha and Lincoln, and he does some cover crops out there. And we were taking temperature samples. It was a bright, sunshiny day, one of those like 90-degree days, right? And it was pretty interesting to see the difference of bare dirt temperature versus the temperature of under a cover crop. I mean, I want to say there was like a 30 or 40 degree difference, right, on what we were seeing just from that cover crop. So I can imagine the evaporation would be a big piece of that.
Yeah, it really does. It does help out with that. I mean, if you get a rain event or something, like we had so we measure rain in hundredths in the West. That's something you got to get used to. We say it rained 72 hundredths this weekend at the Learning Center, but it's dry on the soil surface where we're doing our tests where we've got tillage and things. But if you get into strip till where you got a lot of good residue cover, or you go into no-till and no-till with cover crops, you're still, preventing that moisture from evaporating and seeing, those conditions where that would be available to the plants right under the soil surface there. But definitely in those scenarios where you got bare soil on a hot day, you can really see that temperature impact and it driving what we see in terms of, evaporation. It's not running through the plant. It's not really being useful to you. It's just evaporating off the soil surface.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, you mentioned drip irrigation, Mark, and that's something I have little to no experience on that. Is that something that is installed permanently? I mean, is it underground, or is this something you're laying on top?
So for us, for the most part, it would be permanent. It's like subsurface drip irrigation. So, and there's a lot of places where they've had it in 30 years, and essentially it's thin plastic tubing, like on 30-inch, 40-inch, 60-inch spacings out there, maybe 12 inches below the soil surface, 14 inches below the soil surface, and it's got emitters, every 12 inches that are just slowly dripping that water out under the surface for the plants. Once in a while, we also utilize surface drip if we just need something short term. We need to water an area that's typically dry land. My guys complain about that when I make them do something like that. You got to manually roll out drip tape, but once in a while, it is a nice addition. But for the most part, it's permanent and it's a subsurface system that you can use.
Take us through what's a day in your life like, Mark? What are kind of your day-to-day activities?
So I'm an agronomist at heart. I guess I would say I started, as an agronomist in college, and then I was the Learning Center agronomist here until basically from 2009 until just last year. But it really starts with checking out the fields, then communicating, working with my team of agronomists and other staff here that are kind of working on what we need to do out in the field to keep everything looking nice. And it's not just all weed control and fertility and things like that. It is really thinking about how we can set up a nice experience for the people that come. So you want things to look nice. You really want the demonstrations and that to make sense. So kind of a day is starting out, going and taking a look at the field, then working with the staff to make sure we kind of go through, get our priorities for the day and get to work. And then, of course, there's also a lot of meetings and things like that involved with organizing everything else that needs to go on outside of the learning center, but it really is focused on, what we need to be doing out in the field so that we can get our research work done and give our customers that visit the best experience possible.
Explain to me, how is the interaction between the local farmers around you and the learning center? I mean, how much are farmers, kind of coming in and out and bouncing ideas off of you, or wanting to come see what you're working on next?
So I'd say every time we bring groups out, and it's not always necessarily even just farmers, but we bring out like some of our environmental regulatory groups in Nebraska. We have natural resource districts, farmers. So every time they're out for a visit, we go through the fields, and our goal is really to have an open discussion with them. So when you go out into the field, you really want it to be a learning experience. You don't want it to be just something where you're spewing facts to somebody. And those are really boring and no fun. So we always want that two-way kind of dialogue with everyone that comes through, and we really work at getting those questions out, and then always saying, hey, what kind of suggestions or what kind of things aren't we looking at that maybe you're hearing about that we need to be taking a look at here so it can better support your operation. Because we always want to be, every time, we think maybe we have the best ideas or, the things like that. But until you actually listen to your customer, you may not be hitting the marks. We try to ask everyone that comes through, maybe what of our demonstrations or research are really, I think, moving things forward for you, and then what isn't, and then what could we add that might be really beneficial to you in the future.
Now, with that, do you work very close or much with the academic side then?
We do have some collaborations with, in particular, we work the most with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So they've got an extension or research and extension center only 40 miles away in North Platte. So we do some cooperative trials with them. And then we also work with Kansas State University on some longer term projects. So one of the things we do out of the Learning Center on that kind of sustainability initiative is we have some sites we've set up that are geared to be like a 10-year long-term rotation study where we're doing different tillage practices, no-till versus till. There may be strip till in the mix, cover crops, and we're looking at multiple crop rotations in there, and we're wanting to study what that does to soil systems after 10 years. So we're cooperating with Kansas State University to get all that research done. And we're kind of a hub of it here at Gothenburg, but we've got it spread all across the United States, really. So we have, I'd say, pretty deep collaborations with our university partners here.
Nice. Well, the other thing that kind of comes to mind from a research center and in my thoughts anyway is around sustainability and just general stewardship of the land. What are some of those ways that you're working to continue to drive sustainability, or maybe try finding some of those new practices that we can start incorporating in?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things that we try to highlight with all of our groups we bring through would be, for the most part, unless we're looking at it in a study or have a particular reason, when a grower comes out here, they're going to see, usually strip till or a reduced tillage practice like that on our irrigated acres, and they're almost exclusively going to see no-till on our dryland acres. So that's one thing, is just that when they come, they maybe aren't always hearing that message, but they're seeing that out there in the field. So that would be one thing, and we've really done a lot of that since day one. And then the other one is we're trying to integrate or showcase integrating more and more cover crops into the system. Out here, we've done a lot with, cereal rye and winter wheat, and now we're starting to put more mixes out there as we figure out what plant species and parts of those cover crop mixes are gonna work. I guess out here in the West, it's a little bit, drier environment, very cold winters, very hot summers to deal with, depending on when you plant the cover crop. So kind of one of those pieces is they always see it out in the field, and then it would be a part of what we talk about, and some of our demos would relate to, tillage versus no-till, or cover crops versus not, and advice on cover crops. So, they always see it, and they do hear some about it when they visit the Learning Center.
Well, a lot of times, to change farming practices or start trying something new, seeing is believing, right? Because a lot of times the question is, will it work on my farm, right? And so for the farmers around y'all, to be able to see those types of practices that are happening, that are being successful, I would imagine that helps those folks, say, hey, let's try 40 acres over here or 30 acres over here.
Yeah, and I think it really has. And I mean, I don't want to just say it's what we've done at the Learning Center. It's been a lot of work over years by, at least on that irrigated side, working a lot with strip till and reduced tillage on our irrigated acres to where, when we started here in 2009, most of the fields around were conventional till in some respect, high-speed discs or really heavy vertical tillage, I would say, where today it's almost exclusively strip till or no-till on our irrigated acres. So they've been here 13 years, that span, you've really seen that change in what farmers are doing. I think we played some part in that, but obviously it's been that, their neighbor tries it out, they've seen it here, they start to have success with it, and it's really taken off from a, management standpoint, the success farmers are having with some of those practices.
Well, I would imagine in those 13 years, Mark, that you've seen and been a part of some really exciting experiments and trials and research and things of that nature. What would be at the top of your list that you've been a part of?
I would say at the top of my list, or the most fun to look at, really has been where we're looking at what's going on below ground with corn. So the above ground part, that's easy to measure. How tall is your plant? What's the yield? But if we really want to dive into maybe how a plant's going to respond in a limited water or where it really has to go deep for water, we want to look at the root system. So we've got a lot of research work where we actually take a backhoe and we dig down 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet. I think we've seen roots to over 100 inches under some of our corn here at the Learning Center.
Wow.
It really is fun to look at product differences, and really get that picture of what's going on below ground. And it isn't always about necessarily how deep all the roots are, but just how much root mass is below ground on some of those corn products that we consider to be, really good under drought stress or in a tough scenario where they got to dig deep for water, versus those plants with weaker root systems and how they perform in some of those situations. So that's really one of the most exciting ones because it's really hard to look at anywhere else, and we're willing to rent a backhoe, have some people come in and help us do the root digs and root characterizations of some of our corn products.
Now, one thing I've always been told is that if corn goes through a dry spell, then it'll sink roots down even deeper, and then it has better standability later on in the year. Is all of that is that factual, or is a plant going to put the roots down that it's going to put down?
So if I read the scientific papers, it's a little bit up for debate, but it does seem like plants, if they're in an environment where they need to access water, they will root down deeper to go after it. Now, the thing is, you have to have some subsoil moisture. You've got to have moisture for those roots to go after, to go deep. If you're in a situation where it's just completely dry, corn roots aren't really going to grow into a dry soil because there's not a reason to go there. They're not going to be able to get water. They're not going to be able to get nutrients. But certainly if it gets dry on the surface, I believe they're going to start using some of that lower root system and focus maybe some growth and energy on it. But it is, if you read the scientific papers, it is a little bit up for debate. But I've also seen where, and they don't necessarily know why, but there's a growing body of research that says if plants are stressed early in the season, it seems like if drought comes back later in the season, they do a better job in that scenario.
Oh.
Like they're just geared to respond, and they have a better, I don't know, they just respond better or they perform better in that later stressful environment if they've had some early season drought stress. So that's another interesting field of work that I've seen. I think some of that data actually came out of like the University of Illinois.
No
And
kidding.
they're concerned about, this year is not the case, but really a lot of early season moisture. Your corn doesn't have any stress early season. If it gets stressed end of the season, then it'll crash. Where if it gets some stress early, it's more prepared for the stress late. And they don't have everything figured out about it, but that's something that I've been reading about.
Well, if early stress is good for corn, we should have some pretty good corn out there. So we've been in a pretty dry area around here. We've had a few sprinkles, but not a ton. So put it that way. So
Yeah, it's definitely a dry year in the East in particular.
yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of that too, I mean, I know that your area out there has been. I want to say that you guys went through a pretty hard drought last year, and then have been fairly dry at the beginning of this year. I mean, that can just be an incredibly difficult challenge for farmers. What are some of the recommendations and things that you're seeing on how to manage through some of that, especially like when you start thinking about dry land and things of that nature?
Yeah, so we had in, I think, 2021, it might have been the second or third driest year ever here in Gothenburg. So we were, I think, somewhere around 12 inches or 13 inches on the year, and our average rainfall is right at about 21 inches in a growing season. So definitely a lot of stress. So some of the changes we had to make management-wise irrigation is I really hate to recommend irrigating early, but sometimes to get your crop to germinate, to get it started, like you couldn't plant deep enough to get to moisture. If moisture was there, so you had to take the approach of, watering some early to actually get the crop up and get it started, incorporate your herbicides and things like that. And we actually, at the start of this season, we saw a lot of that. And it's the only 2 years I've seen early years I've seen in Gothenburg since I've been here where we've had to do early season watering to actually get crops that were early planted to germinate. So that's one thing is making that switch to you're going to have to water some early. And then if you're restricted on water, you're going to have to really think about how do I meter that water out to the rest of the season to do the best job I can. And then on dry land, that can be a situation where you think about actually even not planting because it's just so dry, you're not going to get a crop to germinate. So from a management perspective, you can do a couple things. You can plant something and hope it rains and germinates, or you can wait until it rains and find a way to take advantage of that moisture, whether it may not be corn, it may not be soybeans, but it might be a feed crop that cattle producers really need in these conditions where they're not seeing a lot of pasture growth and stuff like that. So it really is a challenging scenario, and it's not one where you think, well, am I going to rotate to corn or soybeans or wheat? It might be kind of a whole spectrum of different crops or management strategies you have to go to.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting take, right? I mean, to really that's a big change management, I mean, to change your whole thought process on even like the type of crop you're putting in.
Yeah, it really is a challenge, and one that really changes depending on what happens with the weather. So we're kind of at a dividing line where Gothenburg's actually been really fortunate this growing season. I think we've had a total of about 8 inches of rain since the 1st of May, which for us is really quite a bit above normal. We were looking at dryland acres where the wheat wasn't going to make it, even here at the Learning Center. Do we try planting a different dryland crop? And then we got the rain, so we went to corn and soybeans and our typical crops. And on West, they did the same thing. So they were looking at, didn't know what they were going to do, probably didn't have seed bought for those acres. Then we started to get rain, and then you got to go out, you got to source your corn seed or do things like that to really take advantage of that moisture. And rain just flips your perspective as a farmer, just like that. Like you can be, have your plan, and it's really a terrible situation from drought. And then once you get rain, you can really flip what you're going to do and go from kind of a year that's a disaster to, okay, well, we're going to raise some cash crops and things like that take advantage of the moisture that we're getting.
I never really thought about, Mark, the issue on just a logistical side, though, right? If all of a sudden that, like I said, that rain comes and you got to kind of change your plan up, you probably didn't have things purchased ahead of time or applied down or whatever the case is.
You want to have a good relationship with the people you're buying seed from, because they may have to pull it in from other parts of the country if they don't have it in stock or things like that. Maybe the rain comes a little later. You're looking to shorter season corn. I mean, there's just a lot of things that play into once you get rain. You got to really start making phone calls and trying to make things happen to see what you can source, see what you can get, and move on from there. I mean, now it doesn't always take a lot of corn. We plant some really dry land areas at like 10,000 seeds per acre. You've got like 18, 20 inches sometimes in between corn plants, which is, I know, totally foreign if you're in the East, but it still does. You still got to source that corn seed to put on those acres.
It's funny on the one irrigation system that we have it's a center pivot on a 160 acre field. The dry land acres, it's all now in CRP ground, but when we used to plant them, I mean, this is just like pure blow sand, right? And you're talking 70 bushel corn on a good year, And that's where Dad and I had the conversation a long time ago was, what's the least amount of population that you can still achieve 70, 80 bushel, right? And we started getting to that point where we would drop that population all the way down. I think we were down to like 12 or 14,000 on the dry land. And in the center pivot, we were probably 34 to 35,000 in the center of it.
Yeah, so that's just the management strategy you got to go to. And you say that 70 bushels, that's really right in the wheelhouse of what some of the dryland guys further west are actually planting for. They get 100 to 120. That's an amazing year to them. Zero is obviously the failure point, and then 70 bushels might be an average crop in there.
Well, speaking of rain, I've heard of this thing called a Rainout Shelter. And I have to ask, what is the Rainout Shelter at the research center?
So it really is something that it came out of us wanting to showcase drought stress. And when we built the facility in like 2008, 2009, those were some of the wettest years Gothenburg ever had. So we started to say, okay, we've got a great facility here, but we can't showcase drought stress. So we had some people in Monsanto at the time, engineers that had experience with ways to create drought stress. And we came up with basically a 180 foot or 160 foot long by 80 foot wide steel building on rails that's totally automated. So when it rains, it detects the raindrops and it actually will move that building. It sits off the plots like 200 feet back, and then it rolls forward 200 feet when it rains to make it so irrigation is really the only way, or if I want it to rain in there, you can leave it open, but the irrigation is the only way you're managing the water of those plots. So you can really generate a lot of drought stress on a year-to-year basis. You don't have the influence of Mother Nature and rain coming in at different times to kind of, you hate to say rain's a problem, but it can really mess up your treatments when you're looking at measuring what corn or soybeans do under drought stress.
Well, I would just assume that that's probably a one of one, and it's no chance of being sold to anybody else, because who wants that, right?
Yes. Now, when we have farmers come through, we really highlight that it would make a great machine shed, because you could park anything in at whatever angle you wanted to, and then the building would just back off, and you could back out.
There we go.
But yeah, it is a one of one deal, but one of the things I worried about when we built it was it really seems excessive, right? You're doing something, you're only protecting about like a third of an acre to study drought on. But what I've seen from farmers is they really appreciate that level of investment in drought stress and investment in understanding maybe how products are going to perform in their limited irrigated acres, or what help you can give them on their limited irrigated acres. So they don't really look at it as a something you just spent a lot of money on. They really look at it as a value to them where you can produce data that helps them out in the field.
Well, it's a perfect segue there, Mark, because I was going to jump into data on that and really talk about just how Gothenburg uses data, and specifically out there, maybe in some of the trials. Are you utilizing a platform like Climate FieldView?
Yes, we are. So some of our small plot research equipment doesn't necessarily fit into Climate FieldView yet, but we do a lot of our work in strip trials. And of course, when you think about what we manage, we've got basically 100 small fields that are in research trials. So you've got to have a way to keep track of that information. What date was, fertilizer applied? What date was it sprayed? Planted, like all that information we bring in through Climate FieldView with our planners. And then if we use our strip plot combine, we get the yield data back through Climate FieldView that way as well. We actually go through and make little field regions for all of our fields, and then any work that we need done at the Learning Center, we can put pins in, put in yellow pins. That means we're post-spraying, and you put in that pin exactly what needs sprayed, and everybody knows where they're going and what to do. So we've got a lot of inroads into Climate FieldView that we're kind of tapping into to make our operations better. We get more data back. We record more of the information more timely, and it also helps us in our workload management, getting everything done and people where they need to be out there in the field.
I would assume that all of you share the same account. So if you drop the pin, everybody else can see it and see the notes attached to it?
Yes. Yep. And we got to be careful not to give everyone access to that account because you can delete things and stuff like that. But yes, everyone shares it and they know you're not to delete certain things unless you can. But yeah, you can, you think about that from a management perspective. Everyone here just can look at their phone. They know what trial they're in. They know what needs done that day, and they know what's been done. Maybe that's just as important as what needs done out there. And it's all on a map, right? If you just send out an email that says, hey, do this, this, and this in these different locations, that's only part of the story. If you're dealing with someone new or not familiar with it, they may not know where they're going, and it may be a little bit of a challenge to find it. With the FieldView, you've got that geospatial aspect where they know where they're at out there in the field all the time.
On a previous episode, we talked about like old school tech, right? And to get to, probably any kind of field level out there dropping a pin, you would have had back in the day, like an HP handheld or a compact or, one of those handheld devices hooked up to a GPS somewhere. And it's just amazing that now you just take your phone out and away you go.
Well, I was even thinking about that just the other day. I happened to see a PowerPoint that was made like in 2003, right? And it's got pictures in it and stuff. And you're like, I don't think we appreciate it probably anymore, but how difficult it was at that time to like get pictures, off of a digital camera onto your computer into a PowerPoint presentation where now, your phone, your tablet, it's all connected to the cloud. You can really upload your photos in real time. It's just, I don't think we stop and appreciate it maybe enough, but it really is something that, from a field equipment perspective and the things you can record and do, it's, probably light years beyond maybe even what we thought was possible about that long ago.
Oh, absolutely. You talk about pictures. Yeah. I mean, first off, who was carrying a digital camera around with them, right? And then you'd have to have a computer to offload it and send it. I think at that point in time, I was probably, I think the most pictures I took were probably on one of those disposable cameras that you used to buy and send in. So I think that's what a majority of my growing up was on.
Yeah. And even like you think of PowerPoints, you used to have to split them onto multiple discs or something like that if they had any size to them and all. It's just wild to think about what you can do now.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I tell you what, the last thing I'd like to really look at, you talked about a little bit around this year and catching, a lot more rain than what you have in the past. I mean, are crops looking good around you overall for the most part then?
I'd say really good, a lot better than what we were looking at early even. A lot of wheat we had written off and things has really responded we're far enough north, it's responded pretty well to the rain. The dryland crops look pretty good. And for the most part, we haven't even in our pivot quarters right here seen a lot of stress show up. It's really been, I'd say just today, we're like a 25 mile an hour south wind and 93 degrees. Now you're starting to see a little stress in different areas of the field. But for the most part, right here, everything looks good. And it's really strange. Typically the West is where you see a lot more drought stress. You lose, the math is you lose 1 inch of precipitation every 25 miles you drive east in Nebraska, from like the west side of the state to the east side of the state. And it's so strange driving east to Lincoln from here and seeing the drought stress just get worse and worse and worse out there in the field. So we really are fortunate, and right here things look pretty good.
Well, the last thing I'll ask on a important question here would be, what's the one piece of advice, the best piece of advice that the farming advice that you've got that maybe you'd like to share with the listeners here?
I've really come down to, don't change everything you do or really fundamentally what you do because of 1 year's events. I would say it can be something that can help you manage stuff, but we kind of always chase the tail of what happened last year and it's okay to do some planning, but really radically change things based on what 1 year's climate did. It really is something that, if 9 years out of 10 it worked, it's probably a good idea. You don't want to have something, 1 year be a problem and then really change everything about your farm, thinking that weather events or that climate's going to be the same next year. It really is, we kind of think in 1 year increments sometimes in farming. It really is that big picture, what happens over 10 years, 15, 20, kind of the span of your operation.
I think that is fantastic advice. So, well, I tell you what, now we're going to get into the rapid fire. So
Okay.
This or that, Mark. I'm going to give you two options, and you just give me the first option that you like here. So the first one, probably the most important one, if I had to say, auger wagon or grain cart?
It's a grain cart. Yes, it's a grain cart. A gravity wagon is what maybe some people call a grain cart in the East, but for us, the wagon with the auger is called a grain cart.
All right. I'll chalk that up as a loss, but we'll keep moving here. How about mountain or beach?
I would say mountain for me.
All right. Makes sense. You're getting closer to the Rockies over there. How about tea or coffee?
I just say both. It doesn't matter what it is. I'll take tea and coffee as long as they're unsweetened.
Unsweetened and caffeinated, right?
Yep.
How about the last one here that I'm going to ask? Mac or PC?
PC, I might like a Mac, but I can't use my wife's Mac computer for nothing, so I'm going to have to stick with a PC.
All right. Well, now, I guess I'm going to do a follow-up. I said that was the last, but what about Apple or Android?
Yeah, that is the one thing about a Mac is I like the Apple environment for a lot of things.
All right. You'd be surprised. Actually, I think we're still in the minority with Apple. Most people I've been talking to, they keep saying Android. I didn't know there's that many Android users out there. So,
yeah, I've been Apple the whole time, and I don't really know why, but that's what I've been. Went from a flip phone to, I think, like an iPhone 5 or something like that.
Nice. Yep. Well, Mark, I tell you what, I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your busy day to jump on the show with us. This has been a great conversation. Is there anything else that we missed that you'd like to cover?
No, I guess not, other than, hey, we are open to visitors. So out here at the Learning Center, certainly feel free to look us up if you're ever traveling west on I-80 through Nebraska. We'd really like to, have you stop by and, kind of show you around what we have here at the Learning Center.
Well, that sounds great. Well, I appreciate it, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. It was really nice visiting with you today.
Hey, a big thanks to Mark for joining us here today. That was a great conversation. And thanks to you, the listener. If you like this podcast, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with a friend or two as well. And as always, Around the Farm is brought to you by Climate FieldView. It can be found wherever you find your podcast at. And until next time, we'll see you around the farm.